Hey folks, it's been almost 2 weeks since my last video, so I think it's just about time I make another one. I've just been so busy having fun. So without further ado, let's talk about it. So one thing that I spent most of last week doing was tracking down a bug in my rendering code where I just could not figure out why multiple point lights weren't rendering for me. So I wasn't getting any crashes, I wasn't getting any weird behavior, but I just shadows were not casting for my point lights, and I just couldn't figure it out. And I spent maybe a week or two trying to track it down, whatever bug was causing that. And I went, you know what, forget it. We'll worry about it later. And then later came last week, and I went, all right, this is going to bother me if I don't figure out why it's not working. Especially because if you have one thing that's not working properly in your code, you don't know if that means that other things are broken as well. And I've tracked it down, and it was in one of my geometry shaders, and I fixed that up. And what you're looking at here is, if you look real nice and closely at my guy, is he's got two shadows coming off of him from two different point light sources. So it's working, and I am very happy that it's working. And just so you know, I'm not faking it. I'm moving around. You see some shadows casting. So that's really great. It looks really cool. I also have a shadow casting. If I zoom out a little bit, you'll see that I have shadows casting from this spotlight I have here in blue on the right side of the screen. And that actually looks pretty cool. So that's some nice ambient lighting. But so what I have now is you can have pretty much as many lights as you want. I think up to 1,000, but you can have up to 5 different shadow casters for each type of light. So you can have 5 point lights casting shadows, 5 spotlights casting shadows, and 5 directional lights casting shadows. Just because of the way I've pre-allocated memory for my shadow casting maps and all that. So that's fun. But yeah, I mean that should be plenty. I mean I don't know any games that use more than like just a handful, of shadow casters at one time. So I'm pretty happy with that. I'm glad the point lights are working, and I'm glad I can forget about that bug until some other weird stuff starts happening. So another thing that I spent this week doing was taking pretty much my whole code folder hierarchy and restructuring it. So I'm not going to pull up the folder tree, but I will pull open my Visual Studio project just to show what I have in here right now. So what I had been doing was I had my Git repository with all of my code in it, and if you don't have a Git repository for your stuff and you're just winging it with no version control, then you're absolutely insane. And I almost have a bit of respect for how insane you are for doing that. But I have a Git repo anyway, long story short, and I pretty much just plopped in whatever third-party libraries I needed, unless they were too big, in which case I just kept them in a separate folder on my machine and pulled in, the compiled libraries as needed. So for example, I'm using PhysX as my physics backend, and so I have the PhysX source repository on my machine, and then I would compile that and then pull the libraries in. And so that's been working okay. It was pretty tedious to manage all of my library dependencies, and I had been building in 32-bit for a while, and I know what you're thinking, like, oh, Skyrim stopped, working in 32-bit like 5 years ago. What's the deal with that? So yeah, I was a little behind on the curve, but I sort of started my project as a 32-bit Windows application, and just kept pushing off. Oh, I got to make this 64-bit longer and longer. And if I'm going to be releasing this game, rather this engine and releasing games on this engine, I'm going to want 64 bits in case we end up having a lot of textures in there. So I figured it was high time I convert my code base to 64-bit, and in the process of doing that, I wanted to make sure that my build process was much less tedious. So I sort of scrapped all of the third-party stuff that I had plopped into my repo, and just made a bunch of different forks and submodules that I linked my Git repository into. So now I have a really clean Git version control structure where I have my main repository, and then every dependency I have, whether it's a library or whatever, lives in a submodule of that repo. So that's really nice. There's not really much to show for that part of it, but what I also did was I reflected that in my CMake build, where I then, for each of the submodules, made sure I had a CMake lists in there so that I could then add those as sub-projects to my main solution for my engine. So now what happens is every time I go to build my engine, it checks all the libraries, static, dynamic, all the dependencies that I have, and goes, okay, do I still have those files? Are those still up to date? Are those still valid? So hypothetically, if I were to go and start this on a new machine, pull my repo, it would just pull in everything, pull in all the submodules, and then all I would have to do is call CMake, generate the project, and build it. And so I wouldn't have to do any manual configuration of any of my dependencies, plop in any libraries, or structure that. And at the end of the day, I also accomplished my original goal, which was to be able to build in 64-bit. So since I cleaned all of this up and made everything an auto building dependency, all I have to do is rebuild my CMake project in 32 or 64 bits, and all of my libraries and dependencies will build automatically for me. So that is super helpful. It only took me 2 days actually to change everything, so I'm sort of wishing I did it sooner because it would have saved me a lot of time and headache. But yeah, I'm pretty happy about how it looks. Yeah, it's been a pretty fun time. So yep, I think that's about all I have to say about it. But it made my life a lot easier, and now I'm going to just keep trucking along with some of my engine features that I have left, and hopefully get started on making a game within the next month or two. I'm pretty excited. I'm going to start small and go from there. I'm sure that'll be a whole different can of worms, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. All right, thanks for listening to me ramble on, folks. Always a pleasure. Until next time.